Hello, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. I just want to say that one of the reasons we love that music is at the beginning of the show is because because Jen Hammoud just starts dancing, and Jen Hammoud gets us in the mood, if you know what I mean. Okay, thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com, and we'll read a few next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe. And this way you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. We've got a really fascinating guest today. He is Peter Strzok. Peter Strzok served in the FBI from 1996 to 2018, rising to the deputy of its counterintelligence division. During his career, he worked around the world against national security threats from China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, and others, including countering state-sponsored disinformation, prosecuting acts of economic espionage, and theft of intellectual property, and combating the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Prior to the FBI, he spent 4 years on active duty in the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, is the New York Times best-selling author of Compromised, Counterintelligence and the Threat of Donald Trump, and he is co-host of the Cleanup on Aisle 45 podcast. Peter, welcome into the back room.
Thank you. Great to be here, Andy.
So I want to get into a bunch of things with you because I think you're a fascinating guy and you've got such an incredible story to continue sharing with people. But I want to just start with more of a macro thing about America today. If you look at the Republican Congress's continued fealty to Donald Trump, if you look at all the attacks on Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, who's just trying to do his job and adhere to the rule of law, uphold the rule of law, if you look at the Supreme Court ethics violations, if you look at the epidemic of gun violence, are we becoming a violent, lawless society?
Well, it's a great question. It's a worrying question. I don't know how anybody in America, regardless of party, looks at the 4 years of the Trump administration, certainly the last days of the Trump administration, and an insurrection, and everything he has said since, right? That he is running for president, seemingly unopposed. I mean, DeSantis is going backwards. And all the things that he is saying right now, I'll pardon the January 6th insurrectionists. I will be your retribution. I'm going to create Trump cities. I am going to institute tests for civil servants. I'm going to suspend security clearances for 30,000 people. All these things he's saying. And if you believe media reporting, Republicans, mainstream Republicans in back rooms don't agree with this, but they are seemingly unwilling to lift a finger to stop it. And I don't know how you look at all those pronouncements and not believe them. I don't know how you look at all those pronouncements coming from the leading candidate for the Republican nomination and not believe that people are willing to go there. And there is a level of nepotism, of corruption, of violence beneath all of this that is, in my mind, in my experience, just antithetical to American democracy, to any democracy, but certainly the American sort of constructed democracy. And it's worrisome, and we're not making progress away from that. Almost half of America is content to abide by that. Half of America is content to advance to the general election with a candidate who espouses all of those horrible anti-democratic things. And it isn't, in my mind, Trump is the symptom. He is, harnessing sentiment, whether that is people feeling disenfranchised, whether that is people speaking from a racist motivation or a misogynistic motivation, whatever their motivation is. It isn't Trump at the end of the day that has to be addressed here. What has to be addressed is the 30 million plus individuals in the United States who are going to vote for him no matter what he says. And we've got to figure out how to address that, because those things are not articulated by the founding fathers in the formation of our nation. And, talking about it with you, getting the word out, is the least we can do. But we've got to figure out as a nation what the hell is going on here and how we sit down and have a dialogue and either fix it or find a way to resolve it. Because we're not a huge chunk of the country is not on a democratic path.
And well, that's really the interesting point and observation, but it's also the most frustrating one because throughout history, we've always had quacks and conspiracy theorists, but they're in a very, very small minority. What we have today is, whether it's 30 million, 40 million, at one point it was, if you look at these election results, almost half the country. Normally, if you tell someone the moon is made out of cheese and the earth is flat, you get rebuked. Yet, with all the evidence we have, how is it still that people hang on to these conspiracies to protect someone who is, I mean, you cannot script a more guilty individual.
Absolutely. And I think, look, there's a very reasonable possibility that Trump is going to be, he's already indicted in New York criminally, that there's a reasonable belief or expectation that he's going to be indicted again in Georgia and or federally, and that he may run for the presidency while under indictment and potentially having been convicted. And I don't think it's going to stop him. So, what's weird today, I mean, if you go back and, Richard Maddow did a great job with Alter kind of bringing back some of the, with Father Coughlin and some of the sort of authoritarian, curious movements within the United States and their reach. I think, so it's not a new phenomenon, but I do think what is new is the sort of pervasive ability to get to this sort of conspiracy mongering information and disinformation, right? I mean, it's one thing if you were living back in 1925 or 1937 or, just after World War II, you could tune into a radio and maybe pick up a show, but it isn't the same thing as like hopping on the internet and finding every last piece of extremist nonsense you might want to find. It is not the same as the reach that, Fox News enjoys and other, more extreme media organizations enjoy getting into the homes of Americans. So this, whatever the sense of belief that might have been in the United States for a long time, I think what has changed in the information age is the pervasiveness of it. And to the extent somebody was curious or looking for a fellow traveler down the path to authoritarianism, it is so much easier to find those sympathetic beliefs today than it was 40, 60, 70 years ago. This is, I think, a new phenomenon that we've really got to find new ways to address.
So you wrote a book called Compromised: Counterintelligence and the Threat of Donald J. Trump. You have said that Donald Trump is our greatest national security threat. You had called the prior election one of the most, or the most important election. It's like deja vu all over again. Where are you today with looking at this election coming up in 2024 with the incredible fact that Donald Trump is yet again the front runner for the GOP nomination? We seem to be headed right down the same path. Are you of the mindset that this is the most important election? Is this the one that either really pushes aside this threat in a major way for good, or is this the election where we literally sink into authoritarianism?
I think it certainly has that potential. I mean, look, I was so worried about 2020 because it was so close. I remain hopeful that 2024 won't be. That people, having seen what Trump did, having seen January 6th, having seen all the convictions that are coming with January 6th, that when it actually comes to the election of 2024, that it won't be close. But, nothing's guaranteed. I mean, we're all praying for, Biden's health.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows what happens between now and the election. I think in terms of the interest of Trump, I mean, look, when it comes to Trump, I share many, certainly personally, I think the same sort of ideas of what Trump's impact on our democracy and what he means is kind of the character of our nation and where he's leading it, that with many people. But in terms of my professional expertise, I spent 20 years looking and defending the national security of the United States of America. I think by far and away, Trump remains an extraordinarily dangerous candidate. When you look, the statements he's made about, if I regain the presidency, I'll solve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Well, how are you going to do that? The only way I can see you do that is you tell Ukraine, essentially, you got to go and sit down at the negotiation table, give Russia something, and the stick that you use, because Ukraine doesn't want to do that, the stick that you use to get them there, say, because we're going to cut or reduce your aid and funding. So Trump's willingness to engage in dialogues and negotiations with international actors who clearly have goals inimical to the national security of the United States of America remains. And his sort of odd fascination with everybody from Vladimir Putin to Kim Jong-un to, tyrants throughout the world and around the world remains. And I don't see his disparagement of Europe continues. His questioning of the NATO alliance continues. I don't know how, from a national security perspective, the prospect of Trump in the White House again, we are not faced with, yet again, a grave threat to our national security. One, because of what he means to our alliances around the world. Two, his past demonstrated behavior with his willingness to put his own interests ahead of those of the nation in an international security environment. So I think the risks are extraordinary. I pray the 2024 election will not be anywhere as close as 2020, but none of us know. I mean, it's a lifetime between now and the election in November 2020.
The conventional wisdom is that on paper, 2024 would be no more beneficial to Trump than 2020, where he lost by 80 or so electoral votes, 8 million popular vote, that a matchup between Biden and Trump, post-insurrection, post-indictment, but blah, 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 there's no chance this man wins. That's conventional wisdom. But you're talking about running against somebody who is almost 80 years old. You mentioned the health before. I'm sure you talk to the same people or listen to the same people I do, and there's lots of doomsday scenarios out there that Trump gets the nomination, and then right around the same time, something happens to Joe Biden. It's either incapacitate him or worse, and Kamala Harris becomes president. You can fill in the blanks on how that may or may not be perceived by some people in this country, especially the racists. And then all of a sudden, it's a different ballgame, because then there's a path to this man becoming president again. And it's just a reality, a political and logical reality, that this guy could be president again. And that's really terrifying.
Right. I agree with you. And I don't, again, to the point of all of us, certainly me speaking, saying, well, I hope 2024 is not nearly as close as 2020. A lot of people in 2015, when he announced it, kind of is a goofball. He's an extremist, but he's never going to navigate the path to become the Republican candidate, let alone get elected if he is. So, there is a history of people assuming this isn't a serious issue. This isn't a serious concern. The process will take care of it, and ignoring it at our peril. And so, I hesitate. I look at my sort of sense of like, oh, it's not going to be close. And I question where that's coming from. And my worry is that, if I'm feeling it, how many other people are feeling it? And the general assumption that, well, there's no way that this guy who's been indicted, who is probably facing more indictments, who may well be headed to prison, there's no way that he's going to be able to advance to the presidency. Why are we saying that? Why is that the assumption? I don't think that's that is not a reasonable, rational perspective to take when you look at the history of the past 6+ years. Mm-hmm. And so I think, my concern is that there is so much fatigue about Trump, and coupled with the awareness of, how crazy and reckless and damaging he was, that people are tired. I mean, he's about to go on CNN for a damn town hall in front of a bunch of, not a town hall of just random citizens from a city, of Republican or likely Republican voters. So it's not even a neutral, balanced audience. And I don't know, my concern in part is that the media and the general sort of public discourse is so tired of the issue that people either aren't going to address it, or if they do, they're concerned about, well, we sound like we've sounded for the past 6 years. Well, yes, we need to sound like we've sounded for the past 6 years, because the man is a threat, because the man did enormous damage to our democracy, and the prospect of 4 more years in the presidency would be far worse. And so we got to keep talking about it, and we can't be complacent. And we've got to, everybody needs to sit in whatever, if you're a Republican, great. I was a Republican, but go, find a reasonable Republican candidate. Trump is the recipe for just disaster.
With all that we know, from the sexism and misogyny to the racism, the homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, to what happened during COVID, the insurrection and the big lie and the indictments, how is it that people still see him as the one? Do they really believe he's amazing and just a victim as he claims he is? Or is there something nefarious that's going on, rooted in racism or whatever, that they just don't care? They want to own the libs.
Again, in my opinion, there are aspects of all of that going on. I think there are certainly, from the sort of least malign to the very malign, the least malign, I think there are folks who feel disenfranchised by the national political process, who saw in Trump somebody who was willing to speak truth to power, speak his mind, talked like they didn't speak in kind of the sort of political non-answers that they believed they heard from most candidates. And that's the best interpretation. I think there's absolutely an element of sort of latent racism going back to before the Civil War that the Civil War was fought over, but was not fixed, that Reconstruction did a huge disservice in many ways in that regard, that we saw throughout the civil rights movement was absolutely present in the United States, that we see today is still present in the United States. I think there is an element of religious extremism, whether you look at attempts to, redefine women's access to reproductive health care, any number of things that are alive and well that are not, in my opinion, tolerant democratic values, that Trump, those folks who have those beliefs, see a champion in Trump. So, I think it gets very complicated and very ugly in the sense that if you want to have a national dialogue about what is going on and what is the source of Trump's support, some of it is noble, but a whole lot of it is not. A whole lot of it is ugly, unacceptable belief that people will acknowledge behind closed doors. But if you want to sit down and say, hey, how much of this is because, you're fundamentally at core a racist, that you are afraid of black or brown or yellow people because you do not think they are equal to you, that is an issue. And to have that conversation in a productive, open way, we got to do it. And I don't know how we get there.
Well, you're right. And that's my main contention, is that it's all rooted in racism. But what Trump did was pour gasoline on that. And now there's a 8-alarm fire, and it's seemingly impossible to put that out. And then you consider the doomsday scenarios that we were talking about a minute ago, and you then layer on top of that this bizarre polling of an unpopularity of Joe Biden, who is probably one of the most successful, productive first-term presidents in our history, who actually kept us from this abyss of authoritarianism, who's at heart a good, decent man. When you think that so many people still worship a monster, and so many people can't see the good that Biden has done, it just makes that landscape even more fertile for craziness.
Yeah, and I do think there is a real concern in my mind about what happens when, again, assuming we get to an election where it is Joe Biden facing off against Trump, that in general, most of the time Americans will choose to keep the status quo if it's generally good for them. I mean, George W. Bush served 2 terms, Obama served 2 terms. It is certainly something that, given the option, Trump was an outlier, I think, since Jimmy Carter to not serve consecutive terms. So, there was a real discontent there that I think will show out. But I do worry where this goes if he, one, if it's a contentious election. And certainly, I don't know if he is not, either way, if he is elected, what some of his more extremist followers feel emboldened and encouraged to do in terms of violence. And on the other hand, if he's not elected, if he's defeated, what those same followers then throw up their hands and say, well, we thought he was doing it. It was another fake robbed election. And so we need to take matters into our own hands. And I think his rhetoric, going down to Waco in the anniversary of the Branch Davidian standoff, and he shows up on stage, and he's got the damn scenes from the attack on the Capitol playing on the screen behind him with piped in music from the January 6th choir. All those folks are in pretrial detention because they are not safe to be released into the community while they're waiting on trial, singing songs that are being broadcast at his campaign rally. This is clear. I mean, it is clear what he is both consciously and subconsciously appealing to in his rhetoric, and that's violence. And that is people, taking matters into their own hand, disobeying the law in order to advance Trump. So I don't, that's already that was his first campaign event. And that's what he chose to embrace. That set the tone. That is the tone and tenor of what we're going to see for the next, whatever we got, 18 months, right? So I don't, we're not headed into a calm period. Let me put it that way. And I worry how far people will feel able to go given the things that Trump is saying.
Given the verdict yesterday in the Proud Boys case, we have 4 people, including the top dog, Enrique Tarrio, convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is not only rare, it's really serious. Given what you just said, and using your experience as a G-man, former FBI guy, the person you just cited as spewing that violent rhetoric, with all we know, with all we've seen, with all we've heard, with all the video of him at his rallies, all the things he's written about on Truth Social, is it conceivable that the buck will stop at Enrique Tarrio and that Trump will somehow not be indicted and convicted ultimately of seditious conspiracy when he was the mastermind of it all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the first thing I would say is you are absolutely right. What a big deal this was. I mean, these charges are complex. I mean, this is a 3-month trial, and you had a jury, a very diligent jury, who took a lot of time to go through all the evidence in a very complicated picture and set of crimes. When you have to, all the elements of the crime, where you have to say, okay, to be guilty of this, you need to have done 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and you have to have evidence to back it all up. The theory of the case, right, what the government was presenting to the jury, was a very complex conspiracy that they proved. And it is unprecedented in our nation's history. And I would highlight and emphasize your point that this is a huge deal. And your listeners need to understand that this was a big deal and a big win for not just DOJ and the FBI, but a big win for democracy and for the American people. Turning then to say, is this it? No. And the question in my mind is how, everybody likes saying, I don't like connective tissue because it just strikes me as a weird analogy. But if this is not the top of the activity, right? There were people, when you look at communications between, Tarrio and Roger Stone, or this guy named Owen Schroyer, who is like Stone's protege, there are communications there on January 6th and before. When you look at the people, in other words, there is a group above the Oath Keepers, above the Proud Boys, above the January 6th activities. When you look at all these war rooms at the Willard Hotel that were set up well in advance of January 6th, everybody from, Roger Stone to Christina Bobb to John Eastman to, Mike Flynn, all this cast of characters, Rudy Giuliani, who were floating around in the environment. And why do you set up something called a war room if you are not expecting war, if you are not trying to do something against the peaceful transfer of power that we've not found the people on the ground, a jury of their peers have found them guilty of doing? So I think certainly I think it's more likely than not that there will be additional higher level charges. What I'm much less certain about is, okay, if you find some of those sort of that one layer around Trump, it is reasonable to me that you might see Eastman or Stone or Rudy or others indicted, and Meadows even. But then making that final leap to Trump, I don't know. I mean, the other point is these cases are hard to make. I mean, these are not only complex cases, but they're difficult. And what we may sit there and it's always a challenge to me, having seen it from the inside, to say, okay, look, we all can look at something in someone and say, this is wrong. They did wrong. This was inappropriate. But then the difference between knowing that and then actually getting to the point where you can go into a courtroom with admissible evidence and prove that the very specific law that they broke with all its elements, you can satisfy that to a unanimous jury beyond a reasonable doubt, each and every one of them, that's a big leap. And the frustration I hear from so many people, particularly those outside of a law enforcement background, is everybody knows that this was wrong. Every reasonable person can look at Trump and say, absolutely, he encouraged this, and he knew that it was going to happen. But the the leap between that to getting into a court of law and proving it is a significant one. And, my belief is that's a good thing, because as hard as it is, and as much as we might want to see Trump prosecuted, we need it to be hard, because the flip side of the next Trump presidency, we've got Rudy Giuliani as the Attorney General. We don't want kangaroo courts rounding up 20,000 Americans and railroading them through the judicial process. So, that the difficulty in proving charges is, in my mind, ultimately a positive thing, as much as it may be frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a long answer to your question. Do we see this getting to Trump? I don't know. I don't think it's a slam dunk. I think it's certainly possible. Is it 50-50 on January 6th? I think there is, in my opinion, there is a greater likelihood that Trump will face federal charges on classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, that he will face charges on campaign fundraising shenanigans where he was, claiming one thing and raising money for something else, potentially for the broad fake elector scheme, and to include Georgia. Then I think that his participation in January 6th is a much more complex.
So let's play this out for a second. You mentioned Rudy, you mentioned Eastman, you mentioned Roger Stone. If they are the ones that are the focus ultimately, and they are facing 20 years, is it likely that they're just going to all flip and go, without him, there's no J6. He told us what to do. We went ahead and took his marching orders, just like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. We were there because of Trump. Don't you think that's where it's ultimately going to go, that Roger Stone ain't going to prison for Donald Trump, that Rudy Giuliani is not going to die in prison for Donald Trump, and that's how they get him?
Yeah, that's what I would hope. I mean, as an investigator, as a prosecutor, you always want to, get enough people, particularly those close to criminal conspiracies, aren't naturally going to cooperate. They typically cooperate when they face some sort of adverse impact on their life, which is usually their own imprisonment. So, and that's why I know everybody is frustrated about how long this is taking. I had some concerns early on about DOJ's pace, but folks also need to understand you can't do all this at once. You have to build up. Why? Because Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes are not going to cooperate with you until they're facing jail time.
Mm-hmm.
And once they're facing jail time, many of them still won't cooperate, but you might get one or two who will. And only at that point are you probably going to get the evidence then that you need against a Rudy Giuliani or a Roger Stone or a John Eastman to be able to then move up to the point where you go to them and say, hey, you haven't cooperated in the slightest, but you're facing an indictment now, so maybe cooperate. And so there is a path you have to take that you can't skip steps when you're facing people whose every bone is not to want to cooperate with you and not to want to, provide information. So do we get there? That's my hope. I would hope some of these, the several 4 or 5 convicted yesterday, the Oath Keepers convicted earlier, that you start seeing some cooperation that then move to that sort of core circle around Trump. But again, to the beginning of our conversation, I have every expectation when and if Trump runs, if he is elected, the first thing he does is pardon everybody. Right. So, that prospect of, even if you get to the point where you have charges against Stone or Eastman or Rudy, just given the pace and how trials unwind, there's a very real chance these trials will be going on, or appeals will be going on, well into the next presidency. And if that presidency is Donald Trump,
well, that would be the least of our problems, I think.
Yeah, well.
And I also want to point out before, I think you're a little optimistic about Rudy Giuliani becoming Attorney General under a Trump administration. That would be a best case scenario. I think it would be more like Joe Tacopina, or maybe even the Kraken, Sidney Powell, like that. That's what I think we'd really be looking at.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think, the parade of horribles that exist out there in terms of what the next administration, and they're already working on it, right? I mean, they have all these brain trusts sitting there. They learned, Steve Bannon and all the masterminds behind the first Trump administration, they understood they wasted first several months of the Trump administration putting loyalists in place. And that,
right.
Again, from
my pillow guy, what's he going to be? He's going to be Secretary of State, right? I want to go back in time a little bit. When we hear Donald Trump go, Russia, 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 that's because of you. You, 3 months before the 2016 election, you opened up this investigation into Donald Trump and his aides and the interaction with Russia and trying to find if there was collusion. I love that you called the case Crossfire Hurricane, which is, of course, the Rolling Stones lyric from Jumpin' Jack Flash. Are you a real big Rolling Stones fan?
Yeah, I am. Huge, huge. I had I was playing, as opening it up, I think I had Hot Rocks, I think, playing, and that song was either on or had just played, and was one of the, you get for cases, typically, certainly on the national security side, they're not named after the real thing. You get a code name to make it a little harder to understand what it was, and they're two words, and so it was just one of those Crossfire Hurricane. It became just, I don't know, what is it, onomatopoetic? I forget the word, but like where something describes what in fact it is, sort of thing. But yeah, I just,
Well,
it came from the Stones, came from Jumpin' Jack Flash, and huge fan. And
Well, it gives us a good glimpse
ended up
into
being
your, not just your musical knowledge, but your sense of humor. I also wondered if you were sitting around mulling over different tunes, because like, if you consider how much victimization Trump claims, maybe a better choice might have been Sympathy for the Devil.
Yeah, I don't want to give Trump any credit whatsoever in any of this. Yeah, Red Bull lost his way. All these, there are a ton of things for Trump that find a lot of resonance in music. But look, I mean, that was the going back. It astounds me that there's any debate left in America whatsoever that this was not a real concern. Anybody who can still sit there and put the two words Russia hoax together. I mean, the fact of the matter was this was unprecedented. His campaign manager, his foreign policy advisor, his national security advisor, all went to jail for lying about their contacts with Russia. And it just person after person after person, when you look at these connections, when you look at his son and his son-in-law and campaign manager sitting down in Trump Tower with a bunch of Russians because they expected they were going to get dirt on Hillary Clinton, knowing that they were from the government of Russia. You can't make it up. And it truly, without hyperbole, is unprecedented in American presidential history.
When you take that and you consider that Republicans don't give a shit about that, but they're obsessed with the simple fact that Hunter Biden has a laptop. We're not sure what's in it, but the fact that he has a laptop is making their heads explode. And so Donald Jr. and Eric literally were sitting, as you say, with Russians, maybe plotting to steal an election. That's okay. The laptop, not okay.
Yeah, and look, all these arguments like, well, what are his foreign business concerns? Does that open him up for, potential coercion or exposure, and does that extend to Biden? Well, look, in general, as a former counterintelligence guy, I am very concerned about any president who might be subject to foreign coercion. So great, let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about Jared's dealings with the Saudis. Let's talk about Jared getting $2-3 billion, whatever it was, from the Saudis at the end of the administration for his little half-assed, investment firm that even Saudi financial advisors were telling themselves internally, don't do this. This is too much of a risk. We don't know anything about this guy. Don't give him the money. Let's talk about all the patents that Ivanka got in the PRC. Let's talk about the little photo op photos of her holding up a can of Goya beans from the Oval Office. Let's go through all these foreign entanglements. And again, it's a reasonable issue. If you're worried about foreign influence in the United States and on the presidency, great. I am too. So let's look at everybody equally. And guess what? It isn't even close. I mean, we could write half a chapter maybe on Hunter and Burisma and the laptop. We could write a series of novels about Trump and his family. So yes, let's have at it. But there's obviously no interest in that. There's obviously not. It is a political stunt. There is no desire to get to the bottom of what the real threats are here. It's just an opportunity to say some magic word that nobody really knows what it means. And the laptop. Oh, fuck this. I'm sorry. Shouldn't swear.
Well, you're right. What the fuck does the laptop mean? I've been asking that since I heard it. It's the first time. So what's in it? I have a laptop too. But what's in the laptop? Can you show us what's in the laptop? When you look back on Russiagate and you look at the Muller investigation, you look at the Muller report, you look at Bill Barr and what he did and what he said about you and what your motivations were. How do you reflect back on that period now? Because a few years gives us the ability to look at things differently, perhaps. Are you really surprised today, more so than you were then, that literally went nowhere? Is there something that you feel the Mueller report and Mueller himself failed at? Where did it go wrong? Why did that not lead to anything in terms of Trump and his inner circle? Because it did lead to other arrests and convictions.
Yeah, that's again, a good question. I think time does give you a much better ability to look at it. And the first thing, personally, it was awful. I mean, it's hard to say in the moment when you're fighting and you're under trauma and you're just trying to get through it and protect everybody and protect your family and protect, your organization, to sit there and say, this is awful. And now, looking back, it was awful. I mean, it was awful personally. It was awful professionally. It was awful from an organizational perspective. I think looking back now, I don't think or most people anticipated the ability of Trump to impact DOJ and the FBI as much as he did. I lay a tremendous amount of that at the feet of Bill Barr. I think Sessions was just kind of a lackey dummy doing whatever. I mean, and Trump hated him for recusing from Russia. Matt Whitaker, fucking lightweight placeholder. But Bill Barr, a malign, smart individual willing to just absolutely corrupt the Department of Justice. And we saw him doing that with cases, walking back Flynn's conviction, walking back Roger Stone's sentencing. We saw him, deep sixing investigations up in New York against Trump and people around him. We saw him appointing people like John Durham to go after and investigate Trump's enemies. And throughout all of this sort of pervasive intimidation of the career employees at, because I'm familiar with it, the FBI and DOJ. I mean, it went on across the government, but the ability to change behavior, even if people don't understand that it was being changed. I mean, we saw it, according to Washington Post and New York Times reporting, arguments between the FBI and DOJ about whether or not they should actually get a search warrant to go down to Mar-a-Lago and recover, after 18 months of failed negotiations, get back this classified information or not. But you have this organizational fear that has been sort of installed through all of this sort of activity. So it does surprise me how effective that was. I would have hoped there would have been a little bit more pushback. I was disappointed. I thought for sure the Mueller report, certainly volume 2 with all the acts of obstruction, would, and Mueller said in his congressional testimony, it was essentially like, look, this is a roadmap for you for impeachment, and this is if he weren't president, we probably would charge him, but we can't because he is president. And went right up to the line of literally saying that. And to all the people saying, well, why doesn't he get prosecuted now? Part of the reason he doesn't get prosecuted now is that Bill Barr took a look at volume 2 and he wrote this lengthy memorandum with a couple of his, close inner circle at DOJ, laying out why he didn't think it was obstruction, why he thought it was all, there are flaws in all this. And whether or not you agree with him, any attempt of DOJ to go in after the fact and try and charge Trump with obstructions laid out in the Mueller report, first thing Trump's going to do is pull out this memorandum from the Attorney General at the time saying this isn't a prosecutable case. And again, if you're trying to persuade one juror to have a reasonable doubt, just one of them, to have one reasonable doubt, this is a pretty compelling, we may disagree with it.
And Barr also attacked and impugned your character and your motivations. He basically said that you kept this investigation open just as a perjury trap for Flynn. As a lay person, I never understood that term, perjury trap. You're either lying or you're not. And so if someone lies, they weren't trapped, they lied. But yet that undermining of your process by the nation's highest law enforcement official, it can't be discounted on any conceivable level.
Yeah, and not at all. And I mean, kind of from the sort of micro ground level, I mean, that was part of the reason when we went in and we talked to Flynn and, he didn't tell us the truth on multiple occasions. There was no trap. We sat there trying to refresh his recollection, read back to him
his own
the
words.
Exact phrases he had used in his conversations with the Russians to try and okay, you're not telling us the truth. Why aren't you telling us the truth? I mean, you're not saying that. You're like, are you sure? Are you sure you never said something with this specific phrase, which I know and and the Russians know you used? No, it doesn't.
So why did he? That's the biggest question of all: is why would he sit there and continue to lie to you, knowing that he knew you all knew he was lying?
And that is one of the, in my mind, biggest unanswered questions. If you look at literally the last page of the Mueller report, one of the appendices is because Trump, despite saying, oh, I'm going to be cooperative, I'm going to sit down and interview. Of course, he never interviewed. And what they negotiated, again, I'm not happy about it, but I was gone by that time. They negotiated, well, we're going to give a list of questions to Trump and he'll fill out answers, which he did. And, 80% of them were crap. At the very end, there were questions about his interaction with Flynn and his knowledge and or direction to Flynn to reach out to the Russians prior to the inauguration and have these conversations. And he just left them all blank. And you go there, pull out the Muller report, look at the last page, the little attachment, all the questions, just left them blank. Like we sat down like you're at some college exam, 10-page exam at the final, you go through and you're like, I just don't like these last 2 pages of questions. I'm not going to answer. We don't know. We don't know why Flynn did that. We don't know what Donald Trump told him to do. We don't know what Donald Trump knew about reaching out to the Russians. We don't know about whether or not there's any sort of agreement to do this in exchange for perceived assistance or anything else, because Trump never, ever answered that question.
Does Putin have something on Trump?
I think the short answer is I think Putin understands very well how to manipulate Trump to get what he wants. I think as a intel guy, I think if you look at the tools and techniques that a professional would use to manipulate somebody to get somebody to do what they wanted, there are a host of ways you can do that, and Trump displays many of those characteristics. I think it is certainly reasonable to believe, Trump's behavior, certainly going back decades when he was in Russia, might give rise to situations where, Russia is going to monitor anybody, senior diplomat, senior American businessman, well-known personality. You're going to be monitored if you go into Russia intensively. And given Trump's past alleged behavior, it would not be at all surprising to me if that his normal behavior was present in Russia, and that Russia has a record of that. Is that the kind of thing that would be the one sole thing, like, the P-tape or anything like that was the one thing that compelled them to do something or not? I don't know that it is. I think it's much more likely that if you look everything from, again, Trump's fascination with authoritarians and seeing Putin as a strong leader who commands the respect of his people, who can snap his fingers and the media says whatever he wants him to say, or he has big parades in Moscow on May Day, and he does all these things that are admirable. I think that's a vulnerability. I think Trump's financial interests, his desire just for money, his cheap desire for money, is a vulnerability. His, susceptibility to flattery is a vulnerability. So if I'm Putin, a former intelligence officer, by the way, for a long time, career intelligence officer, Trump's an easy mark. And I can pick. I got my toolbox. I've got 4, 5, 6 tools that I can work on this guy.
People like me, we watch movies, but you're an FBI guy. You did this for a living, so you know how this stuff is done. But I do know that if I want to catch my dog jumping up on the kitchen counter, I could set up a camera and catch him. Well, if Putin really, over those decades, wanted to get something on Trump, to your point, the toolbox seems pretty easy. And Trump seems like the easiest mark. And I think the financial stuff, more than anything, is the dirt that he ultimately has on him. That's just my lay opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Trump, at the end of the day, 2 things motivate Trump. It's his ego and it's money. And I think, and that was the part of the problem when, he's on the campaign trail saying, I have no business dealings with Russia. Literally at the same time, Michael Cohen's negotiating with the Russians to get Trump to Moscow. So Trump knows that, Cohen knows that, the Russians know that. And so Trump is lying to the entirety of the United States of America. Who knows about it? Well, obviously his folks do, but Putin knows that. And the Russians know that. So that's all of a sudden you've got, this coercive thing. And, Trump may not be as sophisticated like, an intelligence operations thinking person, but he understands leverage and he understands coercion. He came up in the business world through real estate and through, sort of boxing and sports and sort of promotion type activity. He understands. And, Michael Cohen's spoken at length about how he makes what he wants. The things he wants done, he makes it known without saying it. Don't write what you can say. Don't say what you can achieve with a nod of the head. So and it feels very organized, crimey, but that's Trump's business experience throughout his career. And so this unspoken sort of power structure, I have something on you that's unsaid. You know it. I know it. And so just go along with what we want. We don't need to say any of that, because we all understand it. That's him.
Right.
And that's what exists, in my opinion, between him and Russia.
So the last thing I want to get into you with before we end today is Supreme Court ethics. But before that, I just want to ask you real quick, as a former FBI guy, What do you make of all this Republican talk today about defunding the FBI? Is that just insanity to you?
Of course it is, because what are you going to put in this place? I mean, there is no, and I forget which Republican candidate was there saying like, well, he went on Chuck Todd again to the extent of, mainstream media bringing in these kind of extremist candidates saying, well, I'm going to defund the FBI. And Chuck asked him, well, what are you going to replace it with? Well, we just need to get all the old people. And Chuck said, well, you want to defund it, but you're just going to replace it with the same thing. Because at the end of the day, there needs to be, nobody, I think, even on the Republican side, argues that, well, defund the FBI, but we still need somebody to carry on the national counterterrorism mission. We need somebody to carry on the national counterintelligence mission. We need somebody to look at complex crime, whether that's, financial institution fraud or stock fraud or whatever. You still need that same entity. So I think it's just become jargon for people who might be actually upholding the law and investigating violations of law, happening to investigate Republicans. When I was investigating Hillary Clinton, you didn't see anybody on the Republican side talking about defunding the FBI. Yeah, we're investigating the events surrounding the Democratic candidate for the president of the United States. No worries about defunding the FBI then. So it's partisan BS.
So let me ask you your thoughts on this barrage of ethics violations coming out of the Supreme Court, in particular with Clarence Thomas, a little bit with Neil Gorsuch, but in the last 24 hours, this bombshell that dropped about Leonard Leo and Ginny Thomas. Can we get to a place where the Supreme Court has a code of ethics?
We better. And and both the code of ethics and obviously I think the biggest
criminal charges, perhaps?
Oh, criminal, potentially. I mean, some of this goes to like, was there any sort of fraud, when these payments to Ginny, and they're saying like, well, invoice it, but don't reference her, are there, potential wire fraud charges there? I don't know enough about the facts to be able to look at that. But at the end of at the core is there needs to be more disclosure. There needs to be more transparency. It is patently obvious that the information that exists that gives people a reasonable opinion one way or the other about the justice's interests is not available to the public. And what's so frustrating to me is like everybody, why doesn't, Dick Durbin is, all these sternly worded statements that, well, John Roberts needs to really institute something. Well, why? To sit and continually rely on the court to have to do it for themselves, I think we're past that point. I think it's time, yes, the Article 3 is a separate branch of government. Congress has limited authority over it. But come on, it's time. You can't look at all of this activity, particularly around Thomas, and not say that he shouldn't have recused in more instances than he did.
Well, in this Ginny Thomas case, in 2011 and 12, she received upwards of $100,000. And at the end of 2012, guess what? There was a landmark voting rights case that came before the Supreme Court. Thomas was the deciding vote in a 5-4 decision. A plus B equals C, because Leonard Leo was behind that case. That was his case in his nonprofit that he's involved with. So what's the path to get to that code of ethics if it's not the court itself? And it's a hard thing to accomplish through Congress.
You've got, I think, the good news out of all this is that I think a lot of very good investigative journalists are realizing that there's a lot of information in there that is not public and that are going to start digging into this and getting, Freedom of Information Act requests and going back and interviewing people. And I suspect more information will come out. And that's good. Transparency is a good thing. We need transparency. Transparency will solve a huge chunk of this. And if you can't get right now, and I still don't know that there's enough to get that code of ethics to get enhanced disclosure, but more digging and more embarrassing stuff will get it there. And again, to the Thomases in particular, I mean, it's crazy, right? And so yes, Ginny got all these payments. And what's interesting is, I just was reading some of the things this guy named Mark Paletta, who was a Thomas clerk, and then he went and worked at OMB under the Trump administration. Oh, by the way, happened to be with the Thomases on that, mega yacht extravaganza vacation in Southeast Asia that, ProPublica reported costs, would cost equivalent of $500,000. Thomas went on. Guess what? He represented Ginny in her testimony before the January 6th committee. So and she's like, oh, well, Clarence is my best friend. We don't talk about what each other is doing. Well, wait a minute though. This guy who's vacationing with him, who clerked for him, who is now at the forefront of his public defense and all this stuff, is representing her specifically about what she was doing and saying in and around January 6th when she's texting Mark Meadows about, we need to, all the things. But somehow there's this wall, right, that Clarence didn't know a thing about what Jenny was doing or vice versa. And so when those votes go to the Supreme Court about whether or not White House communication should be turned over, the one vote against it at the Supreme Court is Clarence Thomas.
Shocking.
Tell me how that.
Shocking.
Just unbelievable. So hopefully I think there's a lot more to come. I don't think more on Thomas. I think more on other justices. Again, it's not a partisan concern. No. Look at all the justices. If there are things that should have been disclosed that were not, let's see them. And let's put procedures in place, whoever you are, whatever your political bent, that if you're on the highest court in the land, you disclose it. They work for us.
Yeah, well, they don't get that.
They're not a power unto themselves.
Well, they
At
think
the
they
end
are.
of the day, they serve the American people, just like the president, just like senators, just like Congress.
Lifetime appointments. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's a good gig if you can get it, right?
Yeah. Well, Peter, you've been so generous with your time. It was a thrill to have you on. I hope you'll come back again, and thanks again for doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to talk to you.
That's episode 71. If you like what you've been hearing, and even if you don't, let us know. We appreciate the feedback. You can leave us a message at 845-307-7446, email us at backroomandy@gmail.com, or tweet to me at Andy Ostroy. And when you listen, please take a quick moment to rate and review. It's very helpful. And if you do like the podcast, please follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. I want to thank my co-producer, engineer, and editor, Matty Rosenberg, associate producer, Jen Hammoud, Cricket Langell for our artwork, Andy Hollander for our kick-ass music, Patricia Wynn and the Epicurean for the Backroom Studio, and a big thank you again to our guest, Peter Strzok. So keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and we hope you'll join us again next time. Have a great week.